World of Warcraft has some great raids, but none of them are perfect. Most raids have some good bosses, some great bosses, occasionally some pretty bad ones, and every so often some all-time best bosses. So I thought, what is the best possible fantasy raid you could build by taking bosses from all different raids and putting them together into one? I'm going to build my personal perfect raid by selecting some of my favorite bosses of all time. Some things to note, I only started raiding in Legion, so we will only be talking about bosses from the last 3 expansions. I have done every raid in those 3 expansions, so you can bet I am considering every fight in Legion, BFA, and Shadowlands. I've chosen to build a 10 boss raid. I think this is a good amount to have a lot of different bosses represented without getting overwrought, and is round about the number of bosses Blizzard likes to have in their full-length raids lately. So, in a fantasy football-esque roster lineup, my raid will have a first boss, a few early to mid-tier bosses, a few mid to late bosses, a penultimate boss, and a final boss. I think that the first boss, the penultimate boss, and the last boss are pretty well defined spots in a raid where you can compare apples to apples. So for these 3 slots, I will be picking bosses that fit those spots in their original raid. And I won't be moving first, second to last, or last bosses to other spots in my raid. So all of the first bosses are directly competing with each other, and I have chosen just one of them. Same for second to last and end bosses. I think this gives a lot of middle bosses a chance to shine, and it's also more interesting for me because I can build what could theoretically be a real raid, rather than just saying that my perfect fantasy raid would be a raid consisting of 10 end bosses, for instance. I'll be a little more flexible with early, middle, and late bosses, but I still want to try and be true to where bosses fit in their original raids. So let's get started. To kick off my raid, I'll have to drop the first boss. I'll put all the options on screen since there's a more manageable amount for this position in the raid, so you can think about which boss you would pick and maybe guess which one I will pick. So here are all the opening fights to each raid over the last 3 expansions. Oh, but one more caveat. You may have noticed that Odin and the Restless Cabal aren't listed here. That's because, well, yes, Odin is technically the first boss of Trial of Valor, and Restless Cabal is the first boss of Crucible of Storms. Those aren't full-length raids, and I think we can agree those 2 fights are a lot more involved than a typical opening boss of a full-length raid would be. So when considering the fights from these raids, I have lumped Odin, Gwarm, and Restless Cabal in the early mid-tier boss category. Unat and Helya will be pitted against end bosses of all the other raids, as I do think those 2 can hold their own against final bosses of full-length raids. So, which boss am I choosing to kick off my raid?
For Queen Azara!
I'm going Abyssal Commander Savara. This is the first boss to Eternal Palace in BFA, and it's also the boss that'll be kicking off my fantasy raid. This for me is the most fun and engaging first boss to a raid that I've done. You got the whole raid managing these 2 different marks. You got the Frost side and the Fell side, making sure you don't cross over your debuffs, positioning and communicating mechanics, who's going to help soak, who's going to intercept the spear. That all really matters. I think the spikes that the boss shoots out is one of the more interesting just dodge this thing mechanics, more so than like a swirly under your feet or whatever. Overall, there's nothing like mind-blowing here, but for a first boss, I think it gets everyone engaged. It's a really satisfying fight to overcome when you handle everything properly. So that's where my raid's going to start. Next decision is where to go from there. One thing I got to iron out is what path they're going to take through my raid. It's probably a good time to mention, I'm going to be following a modified version of Castle Nathria's raid layout for this. So here's a refresher of that path for that raid for you. I say modified because in Castle Nathria, while yes, technically you can make Council of Blood the 4th boss of that raid, that fight clearly was a huge step up in difficulty and was intended to be the 7th boss, I think we can all safely say. And while you do have a 3-way choice on which boss to go to second, I think again that Huntsman Altimore was clearly the easiest of the 3 and the quote-unquote intended second boss. So my raid will be a sort of forced version of the path that 99% of guilds would have taken through Sion anyway, as I think this gives the wing end bosses a chance to stand out a bit more, and I don't really see the value in pretending to give you those other options. So I'm going to go with this bottom route first, where I have one early boss into a mid boss, which also serves as the wing end boss for this kind of bottom wing here. So for this early boss, I need something big, iconic, and unique fight that really stands out. It's funny because I mentioned kind of basing my pathing off of Castle Nathria, and the boss I'm going with is the same boss that would be in this spot in that raid.
This exchange has no further value. Consider our business concluded. For now.
Castle Nathria Zymox. This is my preferred version of this boss over the Sepulchre one. I just think this is such a good, fun, unique fight. It's nothing like anything you've seen before, and it's really nothing that's been done against since. Not that it's that old, but it's a fight that's so clever in all the different ways that its mechanics overlap. You know, it gives you these two portals you could drop on either side of the room. So you have certain times where you want to kite your ad as far as you can and take the portal at the last second. So by the time it runs all the way across the room, it doesn't catch up to you. You got these seeds spawning in all corners of the room, so the entire room is going to blow up if you don't move these seeds out of the way. And then you have other overlaps where you want to take the portals right away to get your seeds out of there, but you can't come back too soon because you also have ads fixated on you, so if you come back too soon, they'll catch you. So you gotta wait as long as you can before you come back at the last second to just avoid the explosion. It's a fight that's really hard, but it's also unique in the way that it lets you kind of have some casualties. You know, you don't have to be perfect. It's not a fight where as one person dies, you might as well wipe. This is a fight where it presents you these different challenges, and you're kind of rewarded for completing them to like any degree of success. It's a fight where once you get past these really, really rough overlaps, even with like half your raid alive, you can still finish out the last like 10-50% of the boss's health if you have to. Which I think is cool that you can, you know, you can kind of just like sacrifice whoever you need to. You can kind of just get it done for the betterment of the raid. Even if you're going to die, it's better to get that seed out of there so that other people can live. Because you know, even without you, they can still finish off the fight. I think it's really cool. I think it stands well as if I'm going to have only one early boss in this wing. I think it stands on its own really well and gives me a really unique feeling boss.
Your screams will echo throughout eternity!
Next up is my sort of wing end boss for this bottom path of my raid, Painsmith Rasnal from Sanctum of Domination. This is a fight where having the best raid leader in the world honestly doesn't help you that much. Like, it doesn't take long for everyone to learn the moves and the positioning and the timings, and everyone knows what should happen, but none of that can prepare you to dodge the spike wall closing in on you while you've got traps going off and people with chains trying to get to their spots and your tanks flying over to the other side of the platform with the huge hammer hit going off. Nor does any level of preparation help you navigate the onslaught of spike waves and rolling balls and fire in the intermissions. I think this is a personal responsibility fight done right. You've got a great hectic final phase where the chain people have to adapt their positioning on the fly because the hammers and subsequent spikes overlap with spike balls now. A really thematic, nerve-wracking engage where spikes are closing on all sides, and before long the whole platform is going to be covered in spike death if you can't burn the boss down in time. That's one thing I love in a fight is when there can be a really thematic enrage that's more than just, oh, after X number of minutes, the boss just hulks out and one-shots everybody. I think as an enrage, it's done really well. Adds a lot of theme and angst to the end of the fight. Overall, it's an excellent fight that was the real standout for me in Sanctum, and it's going to serve as one of the wing end bosses for my raid. So this is how things stand in my raid after 3 bosses down. I got my opening boss, I have 1 wing done, I have my other top wing to do next. This is a longer wing with 3 bosses, you know, going back to that Castle Nathria template, this would be the left side with Huntsman and Hungering Destroyer and Minerva. So for this, I really want to highlight some early bosses that might be overlooked by other people and really strive for a ramping path of difficulty through this wing. So to start out, I need what would probably be the real second boss that you'd go to before Zymox in my raid. So something earlier than Zymox, a little easier than Zymox. And what I'm going with, I don't think many people would pick.
I'll adorn my web with your bones!
You have to understand, Emerald Nightmare is the first raid I ever did. Regardless of what the memory of that raid has become now, with Mythic being cleared in 1 day and Xavius being a pushover, this was my intro to WoW raiding. So yeah, I'm a bit of an Emerald Nightmare apologist, but when you think about the raid, I think a lot of those early fights were actually pretty good. Elrathrin for All is really a fight that kind of showed me what a raid fight in WoW could be like. You have a shape-shifting boss going between her spider phase and her bird phase. You're picking up feathers and using your extra action button to fly to other platforms. As you're flying over, the rest of your raid's underneath you, running across these spiderweb bridges. You got eggs hatching, spiderlings spawning all over the place. It's just a good time, you know. I don't know. It doesn't take itself too seriously. This isn't trying to be a super intense, hard boss, nor do I think it needs to be if it's the second boss of the raid. It's just a fight I remember very fondly, and I think it's a great addition to the early bosses of my raid. Next up in this wing, for an early mid-boss, I'm going with Opulence from Battle of Dazara Lore and Battle for Azeroth. What a journey this fight is. I think I really appreciate fights that aren't just you in a room with a boss and you stand there and hit it until it dies. This one, you split your raid into two groups, 10 and 10, and you veer off into a temple run jewel heist style adventure where you're fighting mini bosses and dealing with booby trapped rooms, and people are getting teleported to the other group that you can't even see what they're doing on their side. So cross raid communication really matters. Then at phase 2, when you actually engage the boss, both teams kind of loop around and converge, and everyone's stealing these different gems that give different buffs and allow you to deal with the mechanics of the phase. You got like rubies and the topazes, and the healers have the amethysts and sapphires, and there's gold showers going off, and the place is flooding in molten gold that expands and constricts the room. And you have people out on their own, just charging up their crit buff. And then when the ads spawn, they fly into the raid, and everyone gets 100% crit, and you're just blasting the boss, and the ads down. What a cool fight. So now, following this wing of my raid, we've gone through Elrethrun Furl, through Opulence, and that brings us to the end boss for this wing. We got Painsmith on the other wing. So once you kill Painsmith and this upcoming boss, that's when the two paths really converge, and you get on this path to the end of the raid after that. For this next boss, I need a big, iconic fight to really cap off this wing. Something that's maybe even another step up in difficulty after Opulence. Something that compares and contrasts well against Painsmith, which is the end boss I have on the other wing. We have a lot of options here, tons of good choices.
The essence of the cosmos heeds my call.
My pick is going to be Rodden the Despoiled, otherwise known as Nyalotha Rodden. This is based off the original Throne of Thunder Rodden, except this time they perfected it and made sure you actually had to kill a different orb each time. Mythic is really where this boss comes alive, and you have 3 orbs now instead of 2, and they all converge to the boss. You can only kill one of them, so the boss is going to eat 2 of the orbs, which leads to empowering those corresponding mechanics. It's an encounter where you can kind of choose your fight in a way, because you can pick which orb you kill and which 2 mechanics you're going to empower, and all the different combos are interesting and fun to deal with. I really like fights, and there'll be another example of this later, where certain groups of people are dealing with their own tasks within the greater landscape of the overall fight itself. You know, you have the Vita team passing their beam back and forth. If you killed the Void Orb, then you'd also have the Nightmare team, and they're passing their circle back and forth onto the next person. But you can't go too far with that, or else you'd risk the Vita chain all the way out there. So then the next cycle comes around, and you can't kill the Void Orb again, so you have to deal with the mythic mechanic of people playing keep up with the Void Ball, not letting it hit the ground. You have the Void Ad chaining Void Collapse casts, and that got really deadly. Add in an intense DPS burn in the last phase where you're constantly in danger for your life, but you have to be very deliberate and methodical with your healing, because people would get debuffs where if you topped them off, it would just kill you instantly. I think this fight is a great mix of a technical P1 coupled with an all-out DPS burn in the last phase. It makes for one great package, and it's my choice for a wing end boss in my fantasy raid. So this is where my raid stands after 6 bosses. Both wings are complete, and now it's time to finish it out with the last 4. I know I'll have a penultimate boss and an end boss, but before that I have spots for 2 middle to late bosses. These could really be any number of great fights over the last few years, but I want 2 fights that were arguably the most challenging, the most revered, and the most talked about fights in their raid, despite not being positioned at one of those coveted 2 final spots. Calandris completely humbled me as a raider. I really respect fights that make me do something I've never done before, and with this one, it was being in a separate voice call with your bomb partner while having to mute all the other bomb groups just to keep the call clear, because that's how much communication and mind melding was almost required to be successful on this fight. There aren't any surprises, there's no crazy inventive next-gen mechanics. This fight just gets down and dirty. The crab lays his cards on the table and says, "Let's play." And what you're playing is a turbo-attentive, blink and you'll wipe, just skill check of a fight. There are fights in this game where you need certain gear, maybe you need a certain comp. This fight doesn't ask you for any of that. It just asks that you play out of your mind and be crazy precise for 7 minutes straight without a millisecond of lapses. And it does that flawlessly. Not much else to say. It's an incredible fight.
See for yourself the cruel frozen void that lies beyond the margin of Azeroth's skies!
As we approach the end of my raid here, the next boss I'm going with is Star Augur Atreus from the Nighthold in Legion. This boss is the genesis of the Grand Conjunction mechanic that would later be used on Unat and Anduin, where players are marked with different star signs, and you have to make your way to the person with your matching star sign without touching players with the opposite marks, or else in this fight you'll trigger a Grand Shrine, which will result in a wipe. The real genius of this mechanic is that the rest of the mechanics of the fight honestly aren't that hard, but it's the combination of doing what is essentially an amped up version of Heroic while dealing with this Grand Conjunction on top of it that accounts for all of the difficulty and challenge of this encounter. There's 3 unique phases, with the boss going from the Frost phase to the Fell phase and lastly the Void phase. Each of these phases is a little different, but again it's really about dealing with those marks that ramp up over the course of each phase with more and more marks coming out. While in the Frost phase, for instance, you have to do the Grand Conjunction marks while people are being slowed like crazy, and while you want to be stacked to reduce damage from the Nova. And then in the Fell phase, you have very little space to move and stand in, and you want to be on the edges of the room to deal with that Nova, but you got to move around and still do the marks. And then during the Void phase, you have to do it while you're dodging beams and turning away from the ad that's spam casting, and you're burning the boss trying to kill it before it becomes just unhealable damage and before the boss just big bangs you. This is also one of the most cinematic, best looking fights of all time. For a boss that isn't the last or even second to last boss of its raid, I think it's one of the best of all time and easily makes its way into my fantasy raid. So almost to the finish line here. Here's where my raid stands. Just gotta pick a penultimate boss and a final boss. And as I said earlier in the video, for these spots, I'm only considering bosses that were actually in these spots in their original raids. So you can probably picture and get an idea of what bosses that are in consideration here and which way maybe I'll go. So let's talk about that second to last boss that I've chosen to be part of my raid.
Open your mind.
We are back in the Eternal Palace, this time for Zakul, Harbinger of Nyalotha. I love the arc of this fight. P1 shows you how the upstairs realm works, and you say, okay, I got it. And P2 pulls you down to the Fear realm so you can get a taste of that, and you say, okay, Zakul, I'm with you. I see what you're doing here. And then P3 adds in the Delirium realm, which, by the way, is one of my favorite parts or phases to a fight ever. I love fights that empower your character, and in this one you go down there with 80% haste, and your guy is just cracked for as long as you can manage to stave off death. Then in P4, the fight says, okay, now go do everything all at once. This fight gives you all the tools you need to overcome it, but it doesn't use those tools for you. What I mean is, a lot of fights have a mechanic that you need to use to complete another mechanic. So imagine a hypothetical fight where you need, say, the shield for mechanic A to deal with the damage from mechanic B. Therefore, mechanic A must always come before mechanic B so you can actually do the fight correctly. Zakul doesn't hold your hand like that. In Mythic P4, there isn't a static portal to go back upstairs and drop your Hysteria stacks like there is in Heroic. You can only go up and get back into the Fear Realm by using the Summoner's portals themselves. So if you kill all the Summoners, you're out of luck, and you're stuck in your realm, and your Hysteria stacks will become lethal very quickly. Or you're stuck upstairs, and you can't make it down to kill the Echo of Fear from the Psychotic Split, which is one of my favorite mechanics ever. I think this fight nails that theme of trying to not go insane and not succumb to the madness. It's an encounter where you almost aren't focused as much on killing the boss as you are just trying to stay alive, stay sane, run around, and put out fires. This is my personal favorite boss of all time, and it was a no-brainer for the penultimate boss spot in my raid, despite some incredibly stiff competition in that slot over the last 3 expansions. Which brings us to the last boss, the final fight of my fantasy raid. So many raids live and die by their end boss, and that one encounter often becomes synonymous with the raid itself. Nail that fight, and the whole raid is held in high esteem. Conversely, a disappointing end boss is the quickest way to have an entire raid marred and brushed to the side. So, where to go for the ultimate final fight to cap off my raid?
Let me skewer them, slice them, slash them, vivisect them, cut ribbons from their...
Pace yourself, Rimonia. Rushing one's work is so... unflattering.
One of the most impressive things, I think, is that for this format, Denathrius is competing against so many uber important lore characters that have been end bosses over the last 3 expansions. Helya, Gul'dan, KJ, Jaina, Ashara, N'Zoth, Sylvanas, and here you have a character who didn't even exist in the minds of players until the expansion and the raid that he debuted in. And yet, he has just speed ran his way to being an iconic character and a beloved one at that. And by the way, all of that is to say nothing about the fight itself yet. P1 is the calm before the storm. By the time you're ready to kill the boss, it's fairly straightforward, but there's still chances to have an extra player go to 0 stacks so they can DPS during the march, and maybe squeeze out that extra 0.5% of boss HP, which will be huge 5 minutes later when you're ready to transition into P3. It also builds just enough tension that when you get sucked down through that floor, just before you hit the ground for P2, you have enough time to take a deep breath, wipe off your hands, and get ready for real. Phase 2 is all about dealing with the 4 horsemen and sending your kill squads to various platforms to down all the advisors. You're walking through mirrors to teleport around, Remornia's flying around the place, massacring everywhere, and once you get all that down, Donnie teleports to the middle of the room and Phase 3 begins. In Phase 3, half your raid goes back through the mirror one last time, except this time it sends them into another realm, where physics are inverted, and if 2 players from opposite realms touch, they neutralize each other, both dying instantly. This phase has everything. It takes some of the hardest mechanics from the previous 2 phases, adds in some new ones, and you get some absolutely brutal overlaps that are so rewarding to overcome. There's times when you have to drop seeds during Massacre while Ravage is going off, making sure to stay clear of the group in the other realm, all the while with a knockback shortly thereafter. There's an intense DPS burn with a thematic, visual enrage as the whole room is getting sectioned off as Remornia fills huge parts of the platform with Ravages. Amazing phase, amazing fight, amazing boss. So this is my ideal, most perfect raid I could possibly build if I were to pick and choose my favorite fights from all the raids I've ever done. I think it's worth noting that this makeup is not my 10 favorite bosses of all time. As for that list, I would certainly be picking more than just one second to last and end boss. But I thought this was a cool idea to instead try and build a full structured raid, and this is what I ended up with. Thanks for watching.